Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming this evening. I have some housekeeping announcements. Please note the location of the fire exits. Please make sure that your mobile phones and other devices are switched to silent. The meeting is being live streamed and an audio recording is being made. And please switch your microphone on and speak clearly when addressing the committee. Apologies for absence. I have Councillors Nigel Emery and John Campbell, and I understand Councillor James Brooks will be late. And we're expecting Councillor Paul Clark. Moving on to the minutes, the Council is asked to approve the minutes of the meeting held on the 8th of July 2024 as a correct record. Do I have a proposer? Councillor Vickers, and the seconder, Councillor Bevis. All those in favour, please raise your hand. Unanimous, thank you. Under announcements, I'd like to update the committee on the progress of the constitutional review. Officers have undertaken a significant amount of the groundwork, including the following. Meetings have taken place with all 12 heads of service, the 3 directors and the chief executive. Meetings have also taken place with the group leaders and the chairman of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. All members of the working group have been invited to comment on a number of key discussion points. All members of the council have been invited to complete a questionnaire on involvement in the council to inform, in particular, the future of the policy development advisory groups. 2 questionnaires have been circulated to and completed by group leaders, and the chair of Overview and Scrutiny Committee and officers are working to find a way forward in relation to matters upon which members are not all agreed. Finally, the review of the Planning Committee is presently on hold until more information is known about the changes that government intends to make to the Planning Committees as part of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Changes to the Planning Committees are still within the scope of the constitutional review and will be included in the final recommendations to the Governance Committee and Council for adoption next April. Thank you. Number 4, declarations of members' interest. Does any member of the committee have any interest to declare in respect of any item on the agenda? That's no, thank you. Number 5, appointment of the Procurement Act 2023. We are joined by Becca Williams, Procurement Manager, and Lara Ackroyd-Smith, Procurement Solicitor. I will now hand you over to Becca to introduce this report.
Is it illuminated red? Is it on? Right, that's better. Okay, I'll start from the beginning then. So I'm Becca Williams. I'm the Shared Procurement Service Manager, and I work for Crawley, Horsham, Mid Sussex and Mole Valley. And we've been implementing the Procurement Act at all of the 4 councils. So I'm presenting the implementation. We have amended the procurement code and the CSOs in accordance with the legislation that has come in from the government. And the Procurement Act was supposed to come into force on the 28th of October, but it's now coming into force on the 24th of February. Although there is indications that it could be a bit later than that. We're waiting to hear. So Anna Bradley's looking a bit concerned. So we have noticed since we've actually issued the report that there are some minor amendments that need updating. So there are some typos in there, so sorry about that. And we have noticed something around VAT, which there was a bit of an inconsistency in terms of whether it was inclusive of VAT or exclusive of VAT. This kind of stems from Brexit and the fact that they changed the way that they were going to do the thresholds based on the World Trade Organization arrangement. So it previously was excluding VAT and now it's including VAT. So we just have updated it just to make those changes very clear. And we're happy to go through. Laura's happy to give you a summary of the key areas, should you wish to kind of hear a bit more about those and what it means for the council.
Thank you, Becca. So I'm Laura Ackroyd-Smith. I'm Principal Contract and Procurement Solicitor at the Council. Work very closely with the Procurement Department on procurement issues, and obviously we've been working closely preparing the Council for the implementation of the Act. I prepared a briefing note to try and give some context and explain the rationale behind the changes that are coming with the new legislation. As Becca mentioned, Brexit has been a key issue, and that is the reason behind the new legislation. Previously, the current procurement legislation is based on European law when we were part of the EU, and we no longer need to be tied to that legislation post-Brexit. And the government has seen it as an opportunity to refresh the procurement legislation, look at the position again, and allow the government to prioritise national objectives and priorities rather than those set by the EU. So, as Becca mentioned, there has been a delay in implementing the Act. We're awaiting an update, aren't we, on one of the key documents that we will have to consider, the National Procurement Policy Statement. The previous one was published in May and then withdrawn in light of the change of government. That is obviously being looked at again, and that is something that we will have to consider and wait for prior to implementation. Under the current procurement legislation, we are used to having a set of principles that we must adhere to when we are procuring contracts for the council. So we're used to having a system of principles that we must adhere to. The new legislation gives us objectives, but the language feels very similar, doesn't it, and familiar to us really. There's not a radical departure from what we are used to. Obviously, fundamentally, we are there to ensure that the public purse is protected, that the taxpayer is getting value for money when we procure those contracts, and that there is equal treatment in the way that we procure those contracts and treat those suppliers, potential bidders for our contracts, and transparency as well. And transparency is key to the new legislation, as it was to a certain extent, wasn't it, under the current legislation. But the need for transparency is embedded throughout the new legislation, and that will have an impact, considerable impact on what we have to disclose and when during the whole life cycle of the procurement. And my briefing note went into that in more detail, and obviously happy to address any questions you've got. But it's something that we're very aware of, is that there needs to be a greater awareness of what the council's responsibilities are across all of the instructing officers. That will come through training and guidance that will be carried out in the new year. But yeah, there's much more responsibility for us to disclose information, and it's prescriptive as to what we must do and when. And like I say, that is not just during the initial procurement process when we are choosing and selecting the bidders ultimately will win the contract, but during the management process of the contract as that proceeds, and then at the point of a termination as well. So there's a lot more notices that come with it to support that transparency, and therefore we have to be aware that our decision making is subject to scrutiny. There are changes to the award criteria under the new legislation. So we have been used to a system that looks at much more economic circumstances, doesn't it, and criteria. Obviously price is key, and that does remain so. We have to be very, very conscious of budgets, but the new legislation aims to introduce additional criteria that allows the council to have slightly more discretion and introduce more social value, social elements, the sort of social well-being, doesn't it, and environmental well-being, climate considerations, etc. It has to be proportionate to what you are procuring, the nature of the contract. So you must be able to justify the inclusion of that additional criteria, but there is a little more flexibility there, isn't there? And that is now the most advantageous tender, the MAT, as opposed to the most economically advantageous tender that we are used to. The award procedure, one of the things that they have tried to address is that suppliers have raised concerns previously. This is not just, something tied to Horsham, across the board, across public procurement, is feedback. When they do submit a tender, they bid for the contracts, public contracts, that the feedback they receive from the contracting authority hasn't always been consistent and hasn't always necessarily been clear. It's something we've always tried to do, isn't it, when we have been asked to do so and give clarity. But there's much more information required now about the assessment that we have carried out, the evaluation that we have carried out, for all of those bids that have been submitted, and that the unsuccessful bidders can also compare to the actual the winning tender. So there's more clarity to be given over that. Conflicts of interest, obviously we've always been aware of the need to ensure that there is no conflicts of interest when we are procuring contracts, but the Act introduces more sort of onerous assessments, I think, on the council, it's fair to say. We must undertake a sort of assessment, mustn't we, early on at the point of procurement, and keep that under review. So obviously anything that could potentially impact the decisions that the council makes, the suppliers that are chosen, etc., could give rise to a conflict. Not only an actual conflict, but a perceived conflict. So we need to be very aware of that. And again, that's something that we need to raise awareness of.
As part of the notices process, you actually have to certify that you've actually undertaken the conflict of interest assessment. So it kind of formalises much more of the process than it used to do. So it was nice to have when we did it, but now you actually have to state in your documentation that you're actually undertaking that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that it does come out in legislation, where perhaps we've done things as sort of best practice and always sort of held ourselves to a very high standard in the way that we procure. Now, the sort of codification of requirements under the new legislation means that we must do it to ensure compliance. Exclusion of suppliers is another area where additional grounds are given for the council to consider. It again sort of speaks to the government's aim to ensure that we're getting good value and to ensure that we are contracting with suppliers that can deliver what they promise at the point of submitting their tender, so there's not wasted costs and us having to re-procure or problems down the line during the actual implementation of the contract. So there's discretionary grounds and mandatory grounds that we have to consider to see whether a supplier must or can be excluded by the council, that again, we had certain rights, didn't we, under sort of current legislation, but I think there's meant to be a little bit more flexibility for the council to consider, particularly on discretionary reasons for exclusion, whether sort of poor performance in the past is more relevant and could present a risk this time round. Again, trying to protect the taxpayers' money in the public purse and ensure that there's not wasted costs. We can make our own assessment on respect to the discretionary grounds, and the supplier that we're thinking of excluding can say that they have addressed the issues that occurred in the past. Under the Act, it's known as self-cleansing routine, to see if they have learnt their lessons, and we would have to make a judgment as to whether that was appropriate. Again, as part of the transparency requirements, all of our decisions would need to be justified, recorded. We must have that audit trail, and that's all reflected in the requirements of the procurement code, isn't it, that we have updated. And then there's just a sort of general point about, that it does represent significant change. Like I say, some of the language and the terminology and objectives feel familiar to us because it's not a radical departure from what we have had, but there are key changes that we need to adopt to ensure compliance, and that will obviously involve training and guidance, and that is something that Becca and her team have been working on and are rolling out in the new year.
And we did notice, I'm really sorry, that we'd originally said that we were rolling the training out sort of at September in readiness for the 28th of October, and obviously we've had to move that on the basis that it's not coming in, and we kind of thought it was better to have it closer to when the Act was coming out so people could, you know, because some people don't procure all the time, some people just sort of do ad hoc procurement, so it's quite useful for them to have it closer. So that's rolling out in January.
Yeah. And that's why the procurement code needs to be a comprehensive document, doesn't it? So, and it's always available on the intranet, it's available to all officers, so that they can get a sort of comprehensive guide as to what the requirements are. But it's clear throughout that code that, you know, procurement and legal are available to discuss and help them navigate the issues, particularly when we're looking at new legislation and we're learning how to navigate the new responsibilities.
Does anyone have any questions for us? Okay.
Firstly, to incorporate the changes to the procurement code identified by Lara. Second, to allow the monitoring officer to make minor changes to the procurement code, such as correcting inaccuracies and cross-referencing in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Finance and Resources prior to the publication of the full Council agenda. With the meeting's consent, I propose that recommendations 1 on page 9 of the agenda is altered so that it reads: to recommend to full council that it adopts the revised procurement code as contained in Appendix A to this report and subsequently amended with effect from the 24th of February 2025 or such later date as may be determined by central government as the commencement date for the new procurement regime. With the meeting's consent, I propose that a new recommendation 1A be added as follows. 1A, to delegate authority to the monitoring officer to make such minor changes to the procurement code in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Finance and Resources as are required prior to publication of the full Council agenda. I propose recommendations 2 and 3 on page 9 of the agenda remain as stated. If any member does not consent to the altered recommendations, please speak now.
Change.
Yes, if you wouldn't mind.
The first recommendation is recommending to full council the adoption of the procurement code as contained in Appendix A. And Laura has identified a few inaccuracies this evening, so we'd like the ability to update the procurement code to make sure it's accurate. So the additional wording contained in this recommendation is "and subsequently amended." So you're looking at the procurement code in Appendix A and we're recommending any further amendments required to full council.
Do I have a seconder? Sorry, Councillor Croker.
I must say I'm distinctly unhappy with being bounced into this. Well, that's the way it feels anyway, at this stage, without being had a chance to review it at all, these amendments. I'm distinctly unhappy about it. And I don't understand why this couldn't have been circulated earlier. Yeah, regardless of whether they're sensible or whatever, I mean, maybe it's my tiny brain, but it struggles to keep up at times, particularly if I haven't been presented with it as written down.
Okay, I'll ask the monitoring officer for comment.
If I may offer assurances, a final proofread of the documentation was undertaken in the last 48 hours, identifying some inaccuracies in terms of the cross-referencing and also grammatical errors. So any amendments required would be in order to clarify those points in the draft procurement code and the contract standing orders. Nothing else.
Do you wish to respond to that, Councillor Croker?
And you say I'm still remain unhappy.
Okay.
I just wonder whether it would be better to allow a bit of debate on this report first and then move to the recommendation at the end of that. Just might give people a bit more comfort about where we're going.
Yes, we can do that.
Councillor Bevis, can you ensure you put the mic on when you're speaking? So
I do beg your pardon.
that's all right.
Councillor Clark?
Yeah, because I was going to follow on my question. When I look at recommendation little 3, which basically monitoring officer might change the constitution, but you wanted to change item 1 with a 1A. So could you, for me, what I heard you say, I thought they were the same thing. I thought you were just copying. Is there a duplication, or why have you got 1A and then you've got 3, which also talks about the constitution and changes the constitution? So if you could just clarify for my tiny brain, please.
Thank you, Councillor Clark. The additional recommendation for delegation to monitoring officer is 1A, and that's purely in relation to the procurement code only.
Okay, all right. Got it now. Whereas 3 is more than just that, right?
Yeah, so 3 is in relation to updating the constitution to provide reference to the new procurement code.
Got it, thank you.
Okay, so we're happy to go to full debate. So this is questions and answers for you. Okay, first comments? Councillor Bevis?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, that was a really useful presentation. It's quite a dry subject, and you do find yourself nodding off around page 3 or 4 sometimes. I mean, I was particularly interested in the ability for the council to have a bit more discretion over contracts, which I think is very positive. Could I just ask how we ensure that the procurement code itself is policed?
So anything, so any spends that go above £50,000 have to go through my team. So, you know, we're a professional team of procurement professionals that assist them through the process. So they have a dedicated procurement officer that helps them through that. Below that, they're expected to follow the procurement code, but we don't have a sort of a policing necessarily, although we do look at the kind of the contract register, and then we align that with the spend that they have to, their financial spend analysis reports that we get annually. So we do a bit of a cross-check during that process.
Okay, but you know, we're here looking at this code and hopefully approving it, which will be your life in the future. But how do we know that you're living this life and not doing something entirely different?
Well, originally when it actually was written, so I'm trying to think, it was 20 years ago. I've been in post 20 years, so I've been in procurement for 20 years. Very dry subject, and I'm still liking it now. But I was involved in the drafting of it and the developing of it and the reviewing it, and yeah, no, we will follow it. And there's certain things that we have to put in place sort of for higher value things. So above threshold elements, we have to actually, there's certain very prescribed processes that we have to follow that are all audited, because they're all in a procurement portal. So anything over £50,000, the process is audited and auditable and traceable, so that it basically records correspondence you have with suppliers, you know, when you're placing a contract notice, contract award, etc. So, you know, it's a very easy way to see whether a process has been followed or not.
I think the key thing there was that it's auditable, and that's music to my ears. Thank you.
And we get numerous audits.
Right, okay.
I also think, can I just add that obviously instructions to the legal department come in, we ensure compliance. We have a conversation with instructing officers about the need to comply with the code. Early communication with us both as teams helps ensure that is the case, and instructing officers do follow the code. Obviously, you know, sitting as a lawyer, acting in the best interest of the council, we must make sure, you know, compliance takes place.
Comment on we've got a revised code tonight. I think probably most of the revisions in red in here are the result of an email I sent to the monitoring officer yesterday, and I'm pleased to see that you know, we've tidied up on the cum VAT ex VAT issue, so that's really good, and it I think it looks a lot more professional in places. It was just getting a little bit scrappy. So, but I understand where Councillor Croker's coming from. That, you know, you come to a meeting to look at one procedure, and you've got another procedure in front of you, which you've then got to sort of look at and try and work out, well, is that material? Is it going to impact what I was thinking, or is it tidying up and minor things, which in fact it is, but yeah, I do have much sympathy there. Thank you, Chairman.
I was just going to say, I can confirm there's no material changes that have been made in that process. It's just a few bits that were picked up after the submission of the report that we decided that we would get done straight away.
And like you say, stylistically and grammatically, just making sure that it does look as professional as possible. And
Yeah, and readable.
it's correct, yeah, absolutely.
Councillor Buffy?
Thank you, Chair. Mine are just a couple of probably slightly higher level queries or ask for observations. Just from looking through the appendix on the preparing for the Procurement Act, I was interested in the reference to the where is it? You're going to have to do more notices and things like that. So I just wanted kind of a high level observation as to whether, you know, the new code or anything like this, to what extent it's more onerous and to what extent it's likely to have any resource consequences for changes to what you're doing now. And I can throw in the second question at the same time, and cover them both off, which is just around, had a bit of experience recently of frameworks, and this is more a question around to do with the legislation coming in and whether, you know, the new Act has any particular implications for frameworks and our use of them, or is that more something to do with, because that's kind of a slightly different approach that doesn't fall exactly within the existing procurement code? If there's anything to comment on really to do with frameworks, that would be interesting.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So I can cover these off. Essentially, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. It was on the last video.
The onerous, the notices.
Oh, the notices are going to be onerous. There's 12 different separate notices, and we've got to have regard to all of them. Not for all procurement processes, but some of them are going to involve 8 different notices. There's notices for modification of contracts, termination of contract. There's ones for contract award. You have to now place a notice for provisional contract award, and then one subsequently for the actual contract award, confusingly named something that it used to be called. So it is going to be onerous. And what it's going to mean for my team, and there's 5 of us for 4 councils, is it's going to mean that procurement processes are going to take a bit longer than they used to, because we're going to have to put in those steps to actually undertake the admin to actually place those notices, which need to go on a government portal. which hasn't actually been completed yet, which is why I'm a little bit concerned about the 24th of February date. So yes, it is going to be more onerous and it is going to take more resource for legal and for procurement. And then
Moving
moving on.
say, so legal will obviously support procurement, navigating that, particularly in the early days of the implementation and understanding what's got to be issued when, and as we made reference to earlier, increasing awareness, making sure that there's training, so instructing officers are aware of the obligations now upon the council in respect to publishing notices, not just during the actual initial procurement of the contract, but the whole life cycle of the contract. There's notices, as Becca made reference to, so we do need to be aware, and it will be onerous, and certainly as it beds in will be resource intensive.
Yeah. And for contracts that are above £5 million, you have to put in some key performance indicators which get monitored, and they get monitored on the government portal, and we have to report performance against those as well, and they have to be reported annually. So, there's significant, how do I word it?
Compliance burden.
Compliance. And then moving on to the framework point. So under the new legislation, frameworks will still exist. I do, however, feel that they are going to become an area where some of them might actually get challenged for their legality. Some of them are absolutely fine and actually compliant, but there's some frameworks which I think, have been set up and they're not necessarily the best outcomes for the councils. They don't offer necessarily the best value for the council. So you have to take frameworks very much with, a holistic view of everything. They're very, very good when you're actually undertaking sort of larger procurements. Generally, they speed up a process because you don't have to do the assessment of the suppliers prior to actually undertaking a tender. So, all of those are done, they've sort of tried and tested them and they've tested the market. So they can be a really good way of actually doing a procurement process, and they'll still remain under the new legislation. But it's very much about picking the right framework for the right thing that you're actually procuring, and doing all the due diligence, I can't say, on those frameworks.
I think the other thing I would say about frameworks is that there has been a sort of problem in the past, hasn't there, with suppliers coming onto the framework and staying there, and the frameworks not having the flexibility to respond to sort of suppliers coming and going. And so that has been looked at, hasn't it, under the new legislation, and there is a bit more options in respect of suppliers being able to apply during the term of the framework, etc., to come on. So that might give us some additional flexibility, but like Becca said, they certainly have their place and they have got their benefits. But more traditional routes too are still...
They're brilliant for IT equipment. There's nothing better than frameworks for IT equipment or IT hardware or IT software, really, because they get the bulk purchasing power, and you can't compete with what they're able to achieve. Microsoft licenses, for example, they're absolutely brilliant for that. But there are other frameworks which you don't necessarily want to use them for everything. Because we're better sort of engaging with our local supply chains in certain areas and going out to market.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Councillor Croker?
Thank you. I have several. Firstly, the phrase above threshold, does that have particular meaning under the Act?
We use it. It's quite a difficult one to actually come up with, but essentially what it was the EU threshold, and there's not really a sufficient way of calling it other than above threshold. So we kind of use that as a term, and it's defined in a sense that the government legislation basically says the values that actually is. So we kind of use that as a term to form an EU threshold, basically.
Yeah, I ask because there are parts of the document where it's capital A, capital T, and other parts where it's small a, small t. I wondered whether there was any significance in that.
It's a trigger point, isn't it, for the full regime to apply to the contracts. Under the new legislation, you've got a covered procurement, but when we know instructing officers will undertake that assessment of contract value, that procurement threshold, that financial threshold is key to understanding at what point the full regime applies and how that impacts procurement processes. So for us, that's still a useful term, isn't it? And we can look at the grammatical issues, but for instructing officers in the way that procurement code is applied, that above threshold still, I think, is a valid way of actually explaining when the full procurement processes are triggered.
Okay. Second question, 9.7 refers to TUPE with no explanation.
I think we have got it somewhere in the document, but it needs to refer back to it. But it's the transfer of the protection of employees. And basically, it's very complex legislation that I couldn't possibly give you an overview because the legal are paid a significant amount of money to interpret it. But I think we could put the reference, a full reference to the Act there rather than just having it as 2P.
Please.
Just to say, I understand your point. What it has to have a bearing. So when we're entering into contracts, longer term contracts, and we are contracting with a supplier who employs dedicated members of staff to service our contract, at the end of that contract term, there are circumstances under 2P when those members of staff have been working wholly or exclusively on the council's contract, can either transfer to the subsequent service provider or the council if the services come in-house. So there's employment law issues there, there's ramifications for cost and liability in respect of those employees that could transfer, and that's something we need to be aware of at the outset of the procurement.
Thank you. A reference would help there. And finally, 11.2.1 talks about light touch.
A conversation we had just before this meeting.
We did. So we did discuss this prior to the meeting, and I completely forgot to mention it, so I'm really sorry about that. Essentially, it's part of the Procurement Act, which is very different to the rest of the Act. So we do need to refer to it, but because it's so nuanced in the way that it works and the figure that is presented, we have to kind of find a way of referencing to it without actually, fully sort of engaging with what it actually is. So I'm happy to come up with different wording for that to kind of make it a bit easier to understand, and also to align back to where it sits in the Procurement Act.
Yeah, okay, because from a simple person's viewpoint, light touch could imply something that isn't too significant if it goes wrong or something like that.
But that's essentially what it's deemed. So if we're looking at it, for example, so if you were purchasing social care or something, if we were a council that did that, that would fall under that regime. If we're doing sort of works of art or something, sculptures and that kind of thing, that falls under that regime. There's a very specific section, and it'll get into really boring stuff, but common procurement vocabulary, and there's a whole list of codes, basically, which are previous EU codes that align to the light touch regime, and outside of that regime, you can purchase in a less legal way, less restrictive way. So,
Yeah. Sorry.
So I was just going to say that the Act, as the current legislation does, acknowledges that the procurement process should be proportionate to what you are procuring, and what the sort of light touch regime acknowledges is there's certain things that you may be needing to procure that don't justify the entire application of the full regime. So it's known as light touch. So there's some controls, but it's not where the full-blown procurement regime actually applies, and that's sort of justified. There's certain circumstances, certain types of services, etc., that when that applies. So that's why it's to do with proportionality of actually what you are procuring
Okay,
compared to the
I
process.
understand that, but if I read 11.2.1, it implies to me that if it's above this 65,000, then the light touch applies. Whereas to me, it should be the other way around.
It's the value at which they have decided that actually the light touch regime should apply. So anything below that is even less restricted. So although there's a light touch regime that does not, welcome to our world, that does not actually, that the light touch regime, although it's considered light touch, only applies at that financial threshold. Below that, it's considered even less proportionate to have to adhere to the rigmarole of the procurement regulations. So
If it helps, I've suggested that they take out the financial figure here, the pounds figure, and just make reference to the Act so that they can then,
It's probably easier, isn't it? Because
yeah,
that figure
rather than
looks-
have anything in here which might change in the future, is just to make reference to another
Yeah.
document that they will use side by side.
What I don't want to do is I don't want to have too much information in here where people think, oh, I know, I'll just use this regime to kind of circumvent a process. Whereas we have, as procurement officers, have to identify that those specific codes apply to this. So it's a protection, I suppose, not putting it fully in here. The figure is irritating and it's based on the EU equivalent. So years ago, it's a euro base figure that's converted into pounds, which is why it's a weird figure, and all of the figures are weird as well, and they change every 2 years. They change as well due to inflation. So that's why that's a strange figure. There's 5 different strange figures in the Act, at least. So
Yeah, but thank you for pointing that out, because I think, again, it reinforces the message that this
yeah,
needs
that's
to be
really useful.
simple
We
to
need
read.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Okay, anything else?
Well, only on the question of figures, and to ask whether it's really necessary to go to pence. There are ways of wording things, we don't need to go to pence. It just makes it look messy. So that's the final point on the Chair.
Is that in the tables?
And elsewhere in the text.
So yeah. The reason that's in there is because there needs to be a limit in a certain way. And what you'll get is an employee or somebody, and they'll be like, oh, it's £20,000. And then there's a real do they go to that threshold there? So do they do value for money, or do they do the quote process? That way you're actually ensuring that they actually do the value for money threshold if it's 19,999.99.
it seems pedantic, but it's
It
to
does.
remove any ambiguity,
Yeah.
because that penny could make the difference. And so it's to give clarity to the instructing officers that that is the procedure to adhere to, and that it's anything, that penny is what counts. So there's no ambiguity over
Yeah,
there.
because we have had it before where you've got people and they've said, oh, it's 20,000, and then they decide to do the lower one, but actually it should actually be the higher route. So it gives that clarity, and that's from experience actually with that one, because it used to be 20,000, but actually it's better to have it this way, because then there's no, there's no argument. Yeah.
But doesn't less than £20,000 cover that, as opposed to £20,000 or above? It just seems messy, but it's your field, so I'll leave it to
I think,
your
like Becca said,
experience.
it comes from experience of just trying to remove any ambiguity, doesn't it?
Then I can just say 19,999, do you know what I mean? And then they know then for certain, and then I don't have to go through to trying to get them to do the right process.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Vickers.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. That really helped. I, like others, found that quite a difficult document to read and actually get my head round. Under the management, contract management, the final point says to ensure that all key performance indicators set out in the contract are regularly monitored and ensure that a contract performance notice is placed on the government portal annually, reporting the supplier's performance against the KPIs. Can you just explain to me what that actually means?
And can you share which
So-
page we're talking about?
That was, I think it was, hang on, I was just on
Page
it.
41.
No,
It's
it's
section
14,
14.
Yes,
yeah.
yeah.
27,
And
yeah.
it's for the larger contract.
Yeah, so that's,
the large one.
yeah, so basically there's a new requirement, we've never had it before, and it's contracts over 5 million, and you have to do at least 2 KPIs annually, and you've got to report them on the government portal. We've not seen the government
I
portal,
was going to ask what
we
that
don't know what it looks like.
What's that going to look like?
It's not ready yet. So therefore, it's very difficult for us to know from a practical application as it's how it's actually going to work. So we can kind of, Laura's got some of the guidance we've had from the government.
That's not all of it, that's just a selection.
This is the guidance leaflets. This is not actually,
That's not the legislation, that's guidance.
and this is only half of it. So it's just trying to kind of navigate it, and we are going to have to navigate it because it is there's quite a wholesale amount of information that's coming to us.
What I would say about the KPIs, so key performance indicators, that's obviously not new to us in the sense that we have contracts at varying values that will include a service level agreement. So therefore we are demanding certain standards that must be adhered to by our suppliers. And we set those indicators to be able to measure that performance during the life of the contract, and we will hold them to that. And if they fail to perform, if they fail to deliver below those KPIs, yeah, absolutely, then there are mechanisms. It might not be terminating, it might be service credits, it might be other mechanisms, but ultimately you're right that if it was very, very poor performance, would have the right to terminate. So that's not new, the actual need to sort of include KPIs. What is new is that demand that over a certain value you have to include them, and the publication of the data. So the suppliers, that their performance against those KPIs will be made public. It's about, I think the aim is to sort of give public confidence, isn't it, in the delivery of services.
A lot of this came from Grenfell and the issues with that, which is where a lot of these things have come from. And Carillion, the collapse of Carillion as well, has kind of led to these things, which is why they've endeavoured to kind of make these things more prevalent, and you can hold suppliers to account, essentially, is what you've said, isn't it?
Thank you.
Anything else, Councillor Vickers?
That's fine, thank you.
Councillor Clark?
Good Chairman, I've got a list of questions, as you'd expect. I did find the light touch thing quite confusing, actually, because I waded my way through all the other levels and got to this one and thought, what? But then you say if the value of the services is below this amount, then a local tender process can be followed, which implies a much lighter touch, but you're still talking in excess of, less than £625,000, which is a great deal of money. So I do find it, that being a lighter touch being, hey, but £600,000 is rather a lot of money to be light touch, so,
You're
maybe.
right, but it's light to touch those specific services that are covered by that regime. So it's not all services, it's those ones that are specifically defined as sort of light touch services.
And what I would say is there's very little that Horsham would actually buy under that regime, because it's more of the social services, it's more of the kind of fluffy stuff. It's kind of, those kind of things that are more sort of under that school-related things, those kind of things.
Maybe easier just to remind, to point out actually under the tender process number 11, 11.1c gives the definition for what comes under that. So, I mean,
The point, Chairman, is that it's a light touch thing. looking at £625,000, but it's an even lighter touch things looking at less than £625,000, and £625,000 is a great deal of money, was the point. So thank you for that. If I may continue with my questions? Yes. Page 12, item 6.5, implementation will be resource intensive, particularly in the first few months of adjusting to new procurement. Has the extra cost been quantified? I mean, are we going to need to take on extra staff, or are we just going to need to redeploy local resource to make it happen?
We're going to have to absorb it amongst the teams, but it's just what it's going to mean is it's going to mean that we as teams are unable to undertake as many projects at the same time as we usually do. So at the moment my team is dealing with a capacity of about 60 projects that we're working on across the 5 of us. We'll be working on less than that, probably, I don't know, say 55 or something, you know, so it is going to have a resource implication, but it's just going to be, it's going to highlight the need for people to plan properly, which they should be doing anyway. So actually it's going to encourage good behaviour. So it's not a bad thing, it's just a different way that people have to work.
And like I said, in my sort of the preparation of preparing for the Procurement Act document, it speaks to sort of the cultural change that's needed, that there can't just be reliance on procurement and legal to ensure compliance. You know, that's a responsibility of all officers across the council, and when they are procuring, when heads of service are procuring, you know, the staff that actually undertake that, the projects and the contract management, you know, need to play their part in ensuring that that what needs to be complied with is.
Thank you. If I go to page 21, paragraph 4.7, it talks about council employees, business partnerships in which a council employs partner companies, etc., but it doesn't make any notice of councillors.
Is that somewhere else?
In paragraph 4.7 on page 21. And I just wondered, is it covered somewhere else, or is it something that we ought to think about?
Expression of interest.
It's determining the procurement route, 4.7, with the exception of any employee-led mutual organisations, courts will not be invited to consider for individual council employees, etc., and it goes on about a paid director of business with council, but it makes no mention of councillors, that's all. Maybe it's covered somewhere else, but I didn't see it. And should it be? It's just a question.
Guessing, is it one for you? Like, is that covered somewhere else in the Constitution?
I think there's a section at the end of the procurement code in relation to the requirement, excuse me, for councils to declare an interest in relation to any procurement matters. But I don't think the requirement is to preclude themselves from involvement, as is the case for officers.
Section 20.
I missed it, did I?
About members' code of conduct. Direct or indirect interest. It's covered up at that.
In 4.12, we have procurement thresholds and contract award procedures. I was just curious, I mean, are these government limits or are these our limits? So are they set by statute or are they?
No, they're the council's limits. We don't have, so the only one that's set is the above threshold, and then it's up to each council to determine what are their, you know, those limits, I suppose.
Because what springs to mind then is that we're doing this procurement code now, but we are looking at levels of what's the word?
Decision-making framework?
Yes. That's, you know, levels at which decisions are made, and presumably we will tie these in.
So yeah, so the idea is we're going to do it as part of that work is review the thresholds.
So they'll be dovetailed in basically to make sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, it's logical, but one has to
Yeah, no,
ask
we're
the
working
question.
closely with Lauren to ensure that that happens.
Thank you. in contract procedure rules, page 49, I read the sections BI, BII, or B2, or whatever it is. Doesn't differentiate in here whether they're in the budget or not in the budget, and does it matter? I'm not sure. So this is procurement exercise, you know, it has to go to council if it's in the budget, if it's not in the budget, but it does if it doesn't have to go if it's in the budget, but it does have to go if it isn't in the budget. But doesn't seem to be mentioned in it, and I'm not sure it's relevant, but it's something that popped up in my mind. It also ties into the next.
I'll ask the monitoring officer for comment.
I can't actually see where you're referring to, but what I would say is that the contract procedure rules make reference to the financial procedure rules, and they provide that all decisions taken by officers and members sit within both the budget and the policy framework. So you're quite correct in identifying that if something's inside budget, then Cabinet would have the authority to take that, and if it's outside budget, then such a decision will be elevated to full council for approval and inclusion in the budget.
So presumably a contract can't be entered into unless it has gone through that path, is what I'm saying.
Unless budget has been allocated for it.
Yes, so clearly.
Yes, and yes.
But if it's out of budget, it then has to go through the same route that it has to right now.
That's right. If a proposal is inside budget, the contract award would go to Cabinet for approval. If the proposal is outside budget, the contract award would first go to Cabinet and then elevated to full council thereafter to allocate the budget to facilitate that proposal, that decision.
Thank you, Monitoring Officer. Thank you, Chairman. That's the end of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bevis.
Sorry, Chairman. I was just looking at the two tables in the revised code. There's one on page 8 of this revised code, one on 32. And the numbers which are now solely including VAT don't tally with the numbers including VAT in our report for previously. They're not much different. I just wonder how we've arrived at a different set of numbers. Sorry.
Well noted. I'm not sure who can answer that.
It's something I'm happy to look at. It was to do with the latest thresholds, and I believe the updated version has got the reflection of the current thresholds. They are constantly under review anyway, and those thresholds we have been told will change prior to implementation. So they are above threshold level. They are not set in stone anyway. They will change, but I'm more than happy to look at that and reflect any changes that are necessary in an amended report.
Okay, but I mean, we only got the agenda for this committee last week, and this paper only was on our table this evening. I just find it a little bit surprising that knowing that we were going to be discussing this tonight, that we've moved thresholds in that last week. It just, local government doesn't usually move that
No,
fast.
it was the clarity between the including VAT and the excluding VAT. That's why it's changed.
If you look at the table on the report that we had in front of us before, which had both VAT and non-VAT, the VAT figures in that report are different to the report that's now on our table. They're not hugely different. I mean, if they were hugely different, that would be explained by a change to the thresholds. But these are just a little bit random.
My understanding is that the latest version you're looking at reflects the current procurement thresholds as of the 1st of January 2024. So that the latest version should have the correct thresholds, but I take your point, and
it's a bit worrying that we weren't given the latest thresholds. If I hadn't queried the bit about VAT, we wouldn't have had this updated version of the procedure, and then I'm sure it would have been picked up before it got to council, probably, but it just enough there to worry me slightly. I'm sorry.
Well, like I say, they are thresholds that change anyway. It's different to the bands, the thresholds, if you like, that have been set by the council. The document is amended to reflect changes in threshold anyway. But I do take your point. It needs to be as accurate as possible, and I believe the latest version is.
Sorry, could I just ask that the revised figures, when they are absolutely finalised, are circulated to this committee ahead of full council?
Absolutely, yes, of course.
Thank you.
Would you mind turning your machine on?
Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, my brain's thinking of that as well. Any other comments in the room? Councillor Clark?
Yeah, just having spent quite a lot of time reading through this one, I just walked in to find this one, which is quite, just to add to the comments that I made, it's a bit regretful to get this at the last minute, having spent hours going through this one. I know there's not huge changes, but it's not enough time to really get through the changes here. So maybe next time we could have a bit more time, please.
I mean, personally, I think it's interesting if these changes have been made as a consequence of your email from yesterday, then really it's just a question of timing, isn't it? Because you might, if you hadn't have got these updated ones tonight, you would have gone through a long list of amendments that you would have wanted to agree to this evening. So, yes, Councillor Clark.
If I may respond to that, yeah, but it would, I don't know when the changes were made, and if they were made this morning, okay, fine, I get it's a question of timing. But if they were made yesterday, if I had it overnight, I could have probably done a quick Charleston shuffle or whatever it is.
Yes, yes. I think that's been noted by everybody. So thank you for that. Any other comments? Yes, Councillor Buffy.
I would just say that, I don't know, I think I'd still want to say thank you for the work that has been done in turning around these changes in a short period of time, because, you know, they could have just said, yes, we'll look at that and we'll revise it for the final version. So, you know, so I would just like to say thank you for what has been done.
Okay, so if there's no further comments, I'll just remind you what the amendment first amendment was. Which to recommend to full council that it adopts the revised procurement code as contained in Appendix A to this report and subsequently amended under delegated authority that we've given to the monitoring officer and to the officers here with effect from the 24th of February 2025 or such later date as may be determined by central government as the commencement date for the new procurement regime. Taking into account all of your comments tonight. The second one is to add 1A, which is to delegate authority to the monitoring officer to make such minor changes to the procurement code in consultation with the Cabinet Member for Finance and Resources as are required prior to the publication of the full council agenda. With the limits being, if they're being confirmed before the full council meeting.
And of course, I'm sure officers are content to circulate the revised versions of both the procurement code and the contract procedure rules to members to the Governance Committee prior to publication of the full council agenda.
Okay, do I have a seconder?
Happy to second that, Chair.
Sorry, I need to just remind people that the remaining recommendations of 2 and 3 on page 9 of the agenda remain as stated. Do I have a seconder?
Thank you, Chair. Very happy to second that.
Councillor Brooks, thank you. All those in favour? Unanimous, thank you very much.